Good morning, everyone. We have a quorum in the room. If everybody could please take their seats. Thank you very much. A couple of items before we jump into the normal agenda. It is, I forget what the official title is, but it's bring your student, your son, your daughter, your grandchild to work today, and we have a couple of those people in the audience, so welcome to Transportation Committee, and hope you enjoy your day, and especially enjoy your day away from school. The second item that I wanted to mention has little, if nothing, to do with transportation, but I've got the mic, so I'm going to do it. It's the first day of November, so I just want to put that out on everybody's radar. This is a cause that is very personal to me. I have 3 boys, and they all could be affected by this. And my father-in-law passed away a number of years ago from prostate cancer. So this is day 1 of growth, and we'll be monitoring it over the month, but I just wanted to mention that while I had the podium, and again put it on everybody's radar too, because the most important thing about this is to talk about it, is to spread awareness amongst people and let them know of the health concerns, and just to talk about it and support each other. So Shad is also on day 1, and he's way ahead of me. Just give me a couple of days, Shad, and we'll talk. As I said, we have quorum in the room. There are no declarations of interest that I'm aware of. Confirmation of minutes from the 4th of October 2017. Can we carry that? Thank you. Response communications are as noted. The first item, we'll run through the agenda. The first item is a councillor's item from Councillor Blais. Always stop control at the intersection of Famille Laporte Avenue and Mishawashkodi. Is that close? Pretty close. Street. Minotauri Ridge, the intersection of Vista Park Drive and Clarington Avenue, and the intersection of Harvest Valley Avenue and Glastonbury Walk / Baudelaire Drive. Hold. Okay. Next, we also have a councillor's report, which is from Councillor McKenney, who is sponsoring, so to speak, a report from the the Citizens Association, the review of the City of Ottawa's 2013 Transportation Master Plan, and I believe we have 1 delegation signed up for that, so we will hold that. Next is a councillor's item brought forward by Councillor Fleury and Councillor Nussbaum, and that is Sussex Drive speed reduction between Baudelaire Street and Rideau Gate. Can we carry that? Carried. Okay. Next, we have the Parking Services Annual Report. Carried? Carried? Or received, rather, sorry. Number 5 on the list is the Safer Roads Ottawa Program Update 27, and we have a staff presentation for that, so we'll hold that item. Number 6 on the agenda is from the Office of the City Clerk and Solicitor. Status update, Transportation Committee inquiries and motions for the period ending the 25th of October 2017. Carried? All right, so we'll go back to the first item that we have on the list, which is Councillor Blais' item. We don't have a staff presentation on this. I'm wondering, Councillor Blais, if you would like to introduce your item.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As I've laid out in the report, there are 3 requests for always stop controls. 2, the one at Vista Park Drive and Clarington Avenue, and the other at Harvest Valley and Glastonbury, arrived as a result of a public safety meeting held in the community in early September. Traffic-related issues, in particular at these 2 intersections, formed a great portion of the discussion during that meeting. and residents felt very strongly that these measures in these locations would be one element in helping to address the ongoing concerns they have related to various types of traffic issues throughout the neighborhood. The third, at the corner of Family Laporte and Mishawashkode and Minatary Ridge, is in a new community, Cardinal Creek Village, which is part of the OPA 76 expansion lens. Is a brand new community, and the park is already built, and this intersection would provide access from the west side of the community to the east side where the park is located. The west side of the community is where the bulk of the homes are currently constructed. It's also where there's a marketed and now newly established seniors residence. Laporte Drive, while it will eventually serve as a local collector, currently serves as a fairly busy also commercial road, because the very successful Laporte's Nursery still exists at the north end of that road, and therefore it sees a high volume of commercial traffic in the evenings and the weekends, people who are going to pick up their varying various needs for gardening and so on and so forth. And these are people who are not familiar with the community and its existing conditions and necessarily the park or the demographics. And so the community association has asked for this stop sign to be installed to help address those issues and help provide access to the park for children and the seniors who have most recently moved in.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Dean's held it, so I don't know if you have questions for either the councillor or for staff or both.
Well, maybe I don't know. Maybe just a comment. I mean, I think this committee has lost any moral authority to reject these stop signs because we've been passing the ball when someone comes forward. So I'm not going to treat these any different than any others, but I have to say it has been a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of the warrants. One of these three signs is at 11% of a warrant. Okay, it's not the worst because Councillor Minette had wanted 8, but until this term, we hadn't passed any that were under 50. So I think at this point, I note in this report that there's a reference to traffic calming, and we hear from our staff all the time that stop signs, especially unwarranted stop signs, are not traffic calming. And at the last meeting when we were discussing this, I had suggested that we really need to do some form of an education campaign. And I just think this is further evidence. I know, just like we all know, that the community does believe an unwarranted stop sign will stop traffic. But the reality is it's actually probably less safe because it gives children and people crossing there a false sense of security. And we know that cars, when a stop sign is so unwarranted, will just blow through that stop sign. And unless there was the kind of enforcement on every street at every unwarranted stop sign, that's going to happen. And so it concerns me. It's not just Councillor Blaise, because we've been doing this at this committee all term, but I think we have to rethink this, at least for next term, that we have to at least set some sort of policy context for when we will consider an unwarranted stop sign. And perhaps, as I said at the last meeting, it has to be after we've looked at what other traffic calming measures are available to address the concerns that the community are expressing, because they're real. People in every community are very, very, very concerned about traffic and speeding cars and the safety of their families, and I totally understand that. And their fallback, because we don't seem to have a bucket of solutions that are adequately addressing it, is to ask for stop signs. And it puts pressure on the members of council that come here to put in unwarranted stop signs. And we kind of hold our nose and do it, but it's probably not the right thing to do. And so I just think we need a policy conversation about this issue.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that the GM today, Mr. Manconi, is away on city business, but Pat Scrimger's sitting in for him. And one of the discussions that I had with Mr. Manconi over the last couple of days in this regard is I'm going to give direction to staff this morning that they go off and look at other jurisdictions in Ontario, because we're not the only jurisdiction that follows the warrant system. We're not the only jurisdiction where communities are saying, you know what, we don't think the warrant system works for this particular intersection or this stretch of road, and we want action. So other jurisdictions must be dealing with the same conundrum that we are. And so my direction to staff, and Mr. Manconi has indicated that Mr. Scrimshaw will accept it on his behalf, is for staff to go off, look at other jurisdictions in Ontario that use the warrant system, and see how they juggle or balance the competing concerns and needs, sometimes very valid, raised by the community, against the warrant system, which a council was approved as their policy. So I've asked them to go off and do that, and to come back and provide us with the information about how other cities are dealing with that particular issue. Mr. Scrimshaw and I talked about that again this morning, and he's fine with that. And I think this piggybacks nicely on the motion that we passed a couple of meetings ago, which was directed, again, traffic staff, in particular the Safer Roads people, to go off and look at what they're doing in Toronto with their Vision Zero application that they've undertaken, or process they've undertaken over the last couple of months, see how it's working there, see how they've introduced it to the city, and that hopefully will achieve the result that you've mentioned, Councillor Deans, which is to give us more tools in our box to go forward and address these concerns. Before we go to, just before we go to Councillor Moffat, I was wondering, Councillor Boyd, do you want to respond to Councillor Deans? Just want to wait till everybody's done and then do a wrap up? Well, why don't we do a wrap up then, and we'll go to Councillor Moffat.
Thanks. Just briefly on that sort of discussion with staff to look at Ontario, would it be possible, would it be too much effort to look beyond Ontario? If you look at this, if you do any sort of even just brief research on this, you'll see that the all-way stop control is very much a North American thing. It's standard. Our policy on the 3 criteria are the same across Canada, the same across the United States. It's all inside the, in America, it's their, their manual, they have some manual. It's the manual on uniform traffic control devices, and it's their nationwide policy, and it's the exact same policies that we use on the 3 criteria, which is volume, sight lines, and collision data. Yet, in other jurisdictions around the world, always stop control is a foreign thing. Apparently, I mentioned to Councillor Blay in the United Kingdom, from what I understand, they've been banned since 2002. They didn't start permitting always stop control in Sweden until 1980, and they've been used incredibly infrequently. So for whatever reason, it seems that always stop control is incredibly prevalent in North America, yet seldom elsewhere. Now, perhaps it's the roundabout issue, in that we haven't really done that. We seem to introduce them back in the 70s, we failed, and now we're trying to get back at that again. The Cardinal Creek development's a new development. How did we not develop it in a way that we wouldn't have to come back as it's developing and institute always stop control? Why didn't we plan it in a way with roundabouts, with smaller roundabouts, more efficient roundabouts in terms of geography? You know, these are things that we should be looking at, because we know what the issues are. We know what the issues are across suburban Ottawa, across urban Ottawa, across rural Ottawa. We know the traffic impacts that we have. We know that we have these budgets that deal specifically with traffic calming. So we know the issues, yet we keep on developing communities that recreate the same issues. In that investigation, I think we should look beyond Ontario, because you're going to find the same thing across Ontario, and you're going to find.
I have no difficulty with that whatsoever. I'm looking at Mr. Scrimshaw. He has no difficulty with either. So I'll take that as, if we can do a friendly amendment to direction. I will certainly take that.
Right, thank you.
Yes. Councillor Furry, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For me, it's not. It's actually nothing to do with the item. It's actually to your recommendation. I do think we put councillors in a weird position where, for months and months, they work with staff to do the analysis of safety at these intersections. And then we always get the very annoying response that it doesn't meet the warrant, and then that staff don't recommend it, and then, you know, we have to bring the item to committee on behalf of our community to get some tangible solutions. So I do feel for all of us who had to bring these items forward, and I think the core of the issue, to supplement what Councillor Moffat was saying here, is also the way we approach warrants, because it's simply based on a numbers analysis. When if the intersection is unsafe, people won't walk there, so you won't get the numbers. So it's this catch-22 situation where, you know, and but all that to say that I do favor the policy, the revision that the chair's proposing. But I would say that I believe we're in a better position now than we were 4 years ago, when we didn't have the 40,000 a year, when we didn't have the PXO, the pedestrian crosswalks, that have been part of the toolkit and part of the solution in all of these. They certainly have not adequately responded to some of the concerns for slowing down speeds and proper safety at intersections, but they've added some elements to the toolkit. So I do feel that we're in a better position than we were 4 years ago, but I do see a constance, and we've seen it at this committee for the past now 4 or 5 meetings, where each time there's a councillor bringing items forward that don't meet the warrants, but I think it's the warrant system that's just not adequately equipped to deal with it from an operational matter.
Thank you. Councillor Chernyshenko.
Yes, thank you. Although this was raised by Councillor Blais' item and report, I won't make my comments specifically about that, because I think, as Councillor Deans has pointed out, we've gone far enough down the road of approving stop signs that aren't warranted. It would be a little bit odd suddenly today to make this the line that we shall not cross. But on the other hand, what it really does illustrate is a need, of course, for the exploration of other tools. I've similarly been in other jurisdictions where you rarely find a stop sign, and traffic knows that there's no stop signs, so that they slow down and look, because they know they would be foolish not to, and that changes behavior significantly. The education very much is needed also for our constituents to understand that the stop sign isn't the answer to everything, and it won't suddenly calm all traffic and make them safer. I've had this situation just in the last couple of weeks of actually turning down a couple of suggestions, one from staff, a recommendation that we put one in, and another request from a community, would I support their petition? And I said no, because what I've seen on some major thoroughfares, not arterial streets, but frequently used streets through neighborhoods in my ward, is once you put in a stop sign, it then leads to every street that doesn't have one now wonders why it doesn't have one, and then every street has one, and that is an incredibly inefficient way to make your way through a neighborhood. I picked the example of Percy running north-south through the glebe, which, whether you're on a car or in a car or on a bicycle, the fact of having to come to a complete stop at every single intersection every 50 meters, it just has to be the most inefficient way to move around a city. And so what you get is people rolling through. You get the cyclist who does the Idaho stop of, hey, didn't put my foot down, but I don't see anyone. You get cars rolling through. And so in the end, are we any further ahead by having a stop at every corner? So maybe the line we shall not cross today is to ignore this as an issue rather than voting specifically against this item. Thank you.
And would you like to do a wrap-up, Councillor Blais?
Sure, thank you. Certainly I agree with your direction. I do think there is a gap in our capacity. I agree with Councillor Fleury. I do think the $40,000 program has helped. Just by point of reference, for Vista Park in Clarington, which is the lowest of the warrants on Vista Park, we've tried the flex stakes, we've done parking changes, we've had a speed control board. The last option I was provided was speed bumps, which is not a really good option to begin with. And I also agree with Councillor Fleury that at that particular intersection, the residential neighborhood is on the north, the park, the major community park is on the south. There is no curb depression on the park side of the sidewalk to actually allow for a pedestrian crossing to take place, and so it's completely inaccessible, which leads to lower counts of pedestrians trying to cross it. We will be making a change at that intersection next year to facilitate better pedestrian movements in addition to the stop sign. The other challenge I think that still exists, and we've talked about it at Planning Committee a great deal, I'm not sure it's been raised at this particular committee, is the coordination between the transportation analysis at the planning stage and transportation analysis that happens in Vivi and Phil Landry's shop. In speaking with Phil and some of the folks that work with him, they are continually surprised when we go into brand new neighborhoods at some of the lack of attention that was paid to this kind of issue through the planning process, to the point where developers are putting in traffic control measures during the construction process, which makes sense when you've got big, heavy transport trucks and dump trucks and everything like that going through the neighborhood. They're not enforceable under the HTA, and when Phil and his team go in and take a look at them, they're not warranted. And so then the stop signs come out 3 years after people have moved into the neighborhood, and moms and dads have gotten used to the fact that their kid can walk to the park with proper stop controls, and et cetera. And that's not a very good way to treat a community either. So I would highly recommend that as part of this review, additional focus be put on having Phil's shop, whatever the proper name is for that shop, I can't remember, but Phil Landry's shop, more deeply involved in the subdivision process, and that their comments are actually reflected in the final subdivision that is put forward to either the council or to committee.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Scrimshaw, you've heard the initial direction and some refinements and tweaking. Are you clear as to what we're asking you to do going forward?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for their tweaks and refinements. And so carried. Carried. Okay, thank you very much. Next item is a report that has been, I'll use the term sponsored, I suppose, by Councilor McKenney, the Vice Chair. This is a report that outlines a number of recommendations that the FCA has asked the city to look at going forward as we move into the review of our TMP, which won't be happening just yet, but will be happening in the next few years. So I want to thank the Vice Chair for taking this on, and I want to thank the FCA people for sitting down and putting their collective heads together to come up with some suggestions for us to consider going forward. Some of these things staff have already been considering and are in the process of working on. Some of them are new. But again, I want to thank you for your efforts in putting this together. I'm just going to turn it over to the Vice Chair to do an introduction, and then we have two speakers or two delegations to speak to the matter.
Thank you, Chair, for that. Yeah, this is, as the Chair pointed out, a study that was put forward by the Federation of Citizens Association, and they believe an opportunity to now to begin some of the work on the background studies that will contribute to the upcoming transportation master plan. As we know, it follows the official plan normally, well, not always, but the official plan has been bumped right now. It's in an appeal process, so. This is, a look at, how we can make sure, as the Chair pointed out, a lot of it staff are doing, and we are moving forward, but to make sure that we're doing what we can in the interim to continue to increase that modal share for walking, for cycling, for transit use, and to make sure that we don't have any slippage between now and when the next TMP is tabled with Council. So the staff recommendation is to refer the document to the general managers of both Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Development, and the General Manager for Transportation Services, and to have those two general managers sit down with members of the FCA to have that discussion going forward. So I don't know if you've had a chance to look at their review, but it's very good. It certainly sums up our TMP and where we want to go. So I thank you for that. And I will turn it over now to two members of the Federation of Citizens Association to introduce themselves and give us a presentation.
Good morning, Sheila. Thanks for coming down. You're no stranger to the committee process. And Mr. Dorsey, thank you as well. Will this be a joint presentation then?
Yes, it will.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, very much for giving us the opportunity. This has been a process by committee in the FCA, and we know that you have the background information, so we'd like to just capture some of the salient points for each of the recommendations, and we're certainly open to questions. So why the update instead of 2021? We've conducted a transportation survey, and that was done earlier, and led by Alex Cullen and Klaus Balzer and our committee people. There's been a great deal of discussion. The 17 recommendations are what 111 respondents contributed to inside and outside the green belt and their priorities. So our view is that every one of them can and should be looked at before 2021, and that's because most of the issues raised are unrelated to the LRT. They don't always depend on the LRT data to deal with them. The rest are LRT related, but should be dealt with before the LRT starts running. So these are some of the findings. Our purpose today is to encourage the city to kickstart a conversation with its residents about these issues. So the walking area, without going into all the recommendation, the key points here are, in our transportation survey this spring, snow and ice clearance ranked high as a priority issue. The survey made it very clear to us that this problem is needing some fixing. Otherwise, achieving the modal share targets is going to be an uphill challenge. Many pedestrians, especially seniors, won't take transit if they can't get to it easily and safely. We are not saying fix it all at once, but it would be good if you could, but if not, put in some extra resources to continuous improvement year over year. The other recommendation, looking ahead on pedestrians, recommending based on the same underlying consideration, make it easier and safer to get there and to destinations. We know there isn't a lot of money to do everything, but it's certainly worth making the efforts. For example, schools, priorities, senior residents, playgrounds, and where there's unsafe situations. These are all pressing needs. We're not suggesting that legitimate needs need to be aside for the sake of better linking to the transit network. The ideal is to have more money going towards active transportation, including walking. And this is an important conversation worth having, as it deserves the TMP consideration and does not need to wait for the LRT. Looking ahead at Vision Zero, why wouldn't one want to commit to Vision Zero? It's a rhetorical question, but if anyone is dealing with this, it's the traffic deaths should be at zero. And a more useful question, perhaps, how do we get there and by when? The Depression-era gangster John Dillinger was once asked why he robbed banks. He said it's because that's where the money is. In other words, focus on where the most of the accidental deaths are, why they are happening there, and figure out how best to avoid them and deal with that first. So when we look at 2031, the 175th anniversary of the city, wouldn't that be a wonderful celebration? Moving ahead with other cycling, for example, many more cyclists would ride year-round if the paths are cleared of snow and ice. That's what we would like to hear, and I know the cycling community is speaking loudly and clearly on that. It is an opportunity worth pursuing. Looking at public education, which we've been hearing earlier today, it's like a war zone out there sometimes, with drivers blaming cyclists and cyclists blaming drivers. Somehow we have to get beyond that. Better knowledge in the rules and the road is really critical to achieving Vision Zero. Looking at the capacity with the Ottawa Police and the services there, it's integral to achieve this. Better enforcement is the other side of a better education coin. The two do go hand in hand. If we look at going ahead with the Complete Streets model, we are asking that Complete Streets become the default position for all future road design and rehabilitation projects. At minimum, every new street in a greenfield project should be a complete street from the start. That's a challenge for some of the other areas of the city. Complete rehabs in the inner city are a bigger challenge, and obvious from the slow pace of which they are done. Yet streets inside the Greenbelt are where most are walking, cycling is taking place, and where the need for safer street design is arguably the greatest. Where good connectivity between cycling and walking and the transit network, including the LRT, are most needed. And we ask that these issues be given close consideration in the next TMP. Looking on at the development, traffic as a citywide concern. Speeding, congestion, and safety are among the most frequent complaints of councillors or that they receive, getting from their constituents. How do we change that? And each community has its own specific concerns. Would 40K for each councillor be a start to see the assessment of how this money is being spent? Typically, traffic calming is needed near senior residents, schools, community centers, playgrounds.
Sheila, I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm not sure how you're splitting it up, but if you're 5 and 5, then you're eating into Roland's time, so I just wanted to give him an opportunity if he wanted to jump in as well.
Okay.
Yeah, no, if you want to carry on, that's fine.
Okay, so we would like to just really touch base on some of the future items here, and I guess the question is, how much time do we have on this left? About 3 minutes? Sorry, thank you. So the other item here that's a huge one is the traffic downtown. We all know that the downtown traffic is a big problem that needs solving, and sooner the better. It is negatively affecting the quality of life, and that's safety, noise, and pollution. Discourages downtown work of live, work, play, and shop. It affects the economic well-being of the city. We'd like to see the next TMP update commit to a solution as one of its high priorities. Looking at traffic management measures. Traffic management is often conflated with road tolls, which is understandably may regard as a political non-starter. There's much more to traffic management than road tolls. They are one possible tool. The LRT will slow its pace, but even with the LRT, congestion will get worse. So what we need is an adult conversation about this. What we would like is well-informed decision-making. Need to know what traffic management tools are available, which ones work, which don't, and if any might be appropriate for Ottawa. We are recommending that the city begin to look at the options in the next term of council. And whenever it does, we would flag the need to keep the need for the fair equity in mind. Looking at the next recommendation with transit, we all want the LRT to be a big success. Good connectivity between buses and the LRT will be key to traffic uptake. Scheduling integrity, trip frequency, winter snow clearance, park and ride, kiss and ride, all play into that. So too does the conversation or the conversion of express buses into the feeder services at nodal points. We know from the airline industry the shift from point-to-point service to the hub and spoke system that many communities lost direct, non-stop point-to-point service. In many cases, people shifted to cars for the shorter distance trips. We risk seeing that same pattern with feeder bus services. How all of this comes together is not transparent, at least not to all of us. This is a potential problem best before the LRT is up and running. The other key message here is don't tackle this issue in isolation from transit users in each of the affected communities. They have lived the experience. Take advantage of that knowledge. Looking at the fare structure.
So Sheila, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up.
Sure. Okay, so our final recommendations on this, we're looking at paratranspo, looking at the equity issue, the transit-oriented development, and just very key point here is each community is and has its own identity, and it's really critical to honor that in the planning with the 800 catchment area. And then the housing affordable, we looked at that, and the interprovincial connections. So all in all, with this, we're really pleased that this was a unanimously endorsed plan of recommendations, and we really do appreciate being heard here and are open for any questions.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and Roland. Even you were supportive if we didn't hear from you. So there are, as I said earlier this morning, there are a number of things that we are doing which are in sync with what you're suggesting. For example, we did give staff the authority a number of meetings ago to look at the Vision Zero model and how it's been introduced in Toronto and report back to us on that with a view towards incorporating that into how we deal with traffic issues in our city. So that's already underway. On cycling, and you've heard the mayor say this many times, but this term of council has put more money into cycling than any other term of council. That doesn't mean it's enough necessarily, or we can't do more, but we certainly are moving forward on that, and I would suspect that when the TMP comes up for review, the cycling will be a very significant part of that discussion. In a similar way, and Ms. Chi is here with us, but the complete streets model is our go-to with any kind of a street renewal or redesign. That's what we go to first. We can't always incorporate everything into it. It depends on the parameters. Elgin Street is a good example, but with Elgin Street, what we did, to your question about downtown traffic, is we looked at where Elgin Street was failing the worst, and that was with pedestrians and their ability to get around safely and get around if they should have any mobility issues. And so a focus was put on that. So when out of our complete streets toolbox, if you will, that's the piece we focused on that we thought we could get best done. When that goes ahead with the Vice Chair's support over the next year or so, you're going to see much enhanced pedestrian facilities for people going forward on Elgin Street. Finally, on the congestion issue, Councillor Chernyshenko and I co-sponsored a motion earlier this term asking for a congestion study. Unfortunately, while it passed at committee, it didn't pass it at council. But again, that I think is a discussion that is going to come up. We can only look at it once every term of council, but I'm quite certain that's a discussion that's going to come up in the next term of council as well, for hopefully in a more successful fashion, and we can have that discussion that you've suggested that we have. And finally, again, Mr. Scrimshaw is here on behalf of Mr. Manconi, but there was no issue whatsoever when the Vice Chair and I chatted about it with Mr. Manconi about referring it over to his department and also to Mr. Willis's department to have that discussion, to sit down, to look at what your suggestions are, see how they could be incorporated into the development of the TMP review. I'm more than happy to take that direction. We've embedded it right in the report. So again, thank you for putting that all in front of us and giving us the opportunity to push those agendas forward. Now, at this point, though, I suppose there may be more that haven't raised their hands. I have a very short list of people that want to ask questions. I've got the Vice Chair and Councillor Leeper. So we'll start with those two, and I see Councillor Cactus wants to be added as well. So first to the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that presentation. You know, it follows on a conversation we were just having around how we plan our neighborhoods from the get-go. You know, we can go back and we can do the fixes with some traffic calming, whether it's temporary or permanent, and a lot of it works. I know in the ward that in the downtown where that I represent, in those areas where we have permanent traffic calming by way of speed humps, and we did the long-term studies. I don't hear a lot from residents about speeding. I hear a lot about congestion but not necessarily, or dangerous driving sometimes, but not about speeding, and that is essentially because they're narrow roadways and they do have some traffic calming on them. Fortunately, I'm rarely asked. Well, actually, I don't think I've ever been asked to put in a four-way stop in the downtown. But we need to we need to think about how we plan our neighborhoods from the get-go. And if you've got an intersection that's at a park or at a school, in a roadway that abuts a park or a school, and it's so wide that people, and it's got a big long curve, that those folks who actually live in that neighborhood, let's not forget that they actually live there, and they're going to speed through that neighborhood. I think it goes back to the design of the road. We talk about blaming drivers versus cyclists, and I certainly I rarely go out in public where somebody doesn't challenge me on what they saw a cyclist do that day or the day before. But I try to tell people that the Vision Zero model is about removing blame. It's about saying, you know what, nobody wants to go out and injure someone else, and nobody wants to get injured. But what a Vision Zero policy does is it makes us, it compels us to plan our neighborhoods properly, to build our roads properly, so that you can, as a driver, make an error and not be at risk of catastrophically or fatally injuring someone. And as a pedestrian, you can go out with your kids or by yourself, or you can let your kids walk home from school, and a mishap won't result in their being fatally injured or coming out with serious injury. So I thank you for this. I think that it plays into that. How do we increase our modal share for walking, for cycling, for transit use, and people have to be able to be comfortable, safe and comfortable whenever they're walking, whenever they're cycling, and we need to plan neighborhoods where we have good, strong traditional main streets that encourage people to walk through them. We have to design our neighborhoods. I think about the downtown, and we often have conversations about height versus density. But it's really about what happens on the ground and how that encourages people to gather and how it encourages people to walk. And that then encourages people to take transit. If it's a safe, comfortable way of getting there, you'll do it. And that, leads to my last point around, winter maintenance. And, if we're asking people, encouraging people to take transit, they have to be able to get there. Those sidewalks need to be bare. We see far too many instances on our busy transit corridors where there's a small pathway or there's a bank that somebody has to climb over to get onto the bus. And I can tell you, I mean, personally, and I don't think I'm that different than most people, you know, I'll opt for my car if I don't think that my trip in that day will be safe and comfortable. I have a car, and I'll take it. So if you look at just the Laurier bike lanes alone, you know, we've got over 4,000 people a day back and forth. And if we, you know, if that wasn't there today, that's 2,000 cars in the morning, 2,000 in the afternoon that we could potentially be adding to that one corridor. And only the people who live downtown would get downtown. So it's, you know, it's to everyone's benefit. It makes it a healthier environment for us. It makes us healthier, and it gets people out. It gets people less isolated. Just all around, the way we move about is probably the most important thing we do as a city, and that goes from planning our buildings, planning our neighborhoods, planning our roads, all the way down to how we then deal with that operationally. So I thank you for this. It's, you know, as the chair said, a lot of it we are doing. It's a good reminder, but it's always good for us to get a push, and I will continue to keep this to push myself and to keep considering what we can do more of. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. One of the things I should have also mentioned, Sheila, is that, now she just left the room briefly, but Superintendent McKenna was in the room during the presentation as well. She's here as part of the Safer Roads presentation, so your piece around enforcement, here she comes right now. We're just talking about you, Superintendent. Just mentioning that it was a happy circumstance that you happened to be in the room during this presentation, and where the presentation spoke to the need for public education and for enforcement by our police service, and what better person to hear that message than you, who's here to support the Safer Roads presentation. So you can consider that message, I think, as being received by the OPS, and they can come back and to their department and have a discussion around that as well. So I should have mentioned that initially. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much for the presentation. Both it was at the half-day workshop that you held at Tom Brown, at which a lot of this was crafted, and it was a privilege to be able to participate in that. Many of the recommendations that you've made resonate with me. The Kitchissippi ward, as you know, has grown by about 6% in terms of population or so over the last 5 years. Catherine McKenney's downtown ward has also grown, and in the rest of the inside the Greenbelt area, the population has held relatively stable or even declined. We're seeing the effects of our policies of intensification in the ward in terms of really congested arterials, the behaviors that begin to arise when the arterials are congested and people opt to go through the residential neighborhoods at speeds that may not even technically be speeding, but which are too quick. Now, you heard Councillor Fleury a little bit earlier speaking about the fact that we are in better shape today to deal with the traffic safety impacts of intensification. The temporary traffic calming budget that each councillor gets at $41,000 has allowed us to put things like flexi posts in the middle of the road. We're starting to get some flexibility in our ward around putting planters in the street, doing things like putting the speed boards up in order to be able to remind drivers of what the speed limit is. Those are all really effective in my mind, but I think one of my assistants told me the other day, we have 46 streets in the ward right now where we've determined that, in fact, you know, some traffic calming is necessary. And almost all of them are the result of relatively high-speed cut-through traffic that is the result of people trying to bypass our congested arterials. In the wake, you know, knowing this and knowing what intensification, which we absolutely have to pursue, is doing to our downtown wards, in the next transportation master plan visiting, are our modal shares appropriate? We've listed what the modal shares are. You've made some recommendations that would help us to get to those modal shares. But for example, I think it was I can't remember the exact number that was on the screen, is it well over half of traffic in 2031 for the commute is intended to be, or not intended, foreseen to still be in vehicles. Do we need to look at our modal share targets? Have you put a lot of thought into that?
Thank you for the question, Jeff. Clearly, from our perspective, achieving the modal share targets that are set out in the current plan will be a challenge. Our first concern was to see what can be done to achieve those. Clearly, if we could get above those, that would be much better. And I think you ask a very important question, which really I think ultimately goes to do we need to redesign the way we're looking at transportation within the city? It's a big open-ended question, but if the goal is to de-emphasize the use of cars as we transition from the car-centric 1960s, hopefully the near future, we need more ambitious targets, in my view, and I think they would benefit the city. If I could just take a second to both thank Councillor McKinney and yourself for the comments that you've made, because I think they very nicely capture the essence of what we're trying to say. But I'd also focus on one difference between the two of you, as I hear it anyway, which is that your circumstances in each ward are in fact quite different. And that speaks to another important point that I think is a thematic element of our presentation, which is that each community across the city has its own specific characteristics, and it needs to be looked at from that perspective, as much from the bottom up as it does from the top down. And we would hope that that is something that's infused throughout the revision of the Transportation Master Plan as you go forward.
Thank you. I think that's not only true for the Transportation Master Plan, but I think as we revisit the official plan, some granularity and some nuance between different communities. You know, it's not a monolith within the Greenbelt. There isn't downtown within the Greenbelt and outside. There are different dynamics at play in different parts of the ward that we're going to need to take consideration of as we redo all of our master plans in the next term of council. I wanted to ask one question as well with respect to sidewalk winter maintenance. You've asserted the need to improve that, but what are your members telling you winter sidewalks are like right now?
Well, unfortunately, what they're telling us is that it's nowhere near as good as it needs to be, which is why we've highlighted this as one of the key issues. Clearly, if you have to jump over a snowbank to get to a bus stop, something's wrong. And certainly in the inner city, as we all know, by the time you get well into the winter, you've got snow mounds high on the street. And if you layer a big snowstorm on top of that, you can't walk on the streets, cars can't get through on the streets, and you can't walk on the sidewalks. It's a challenge. And it has all sorts of implications in terms of the health and well-being of the residents and the health and economic well-being of the city. So certainly from my perspective, from our perspective, this should be one of the top priority areas to deal with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The same assertion was made that we need to improve our winter clearing of the cycling lanes. Just a bit of nuance on that one. I cycle in daily, 365 days a year. The Laurier bike lanes are virtually always clear. The Albert multi-use path is virtually always clear. Are you talking about an improvement of the current clearing standards or an expansion in order to help people get to the downtown?
Well, both would be nice, but clearly the expansion, I think, is what needs the most attention. That's what we're hearing from the cycling community.
There are some key gaps that are missing. I'm in Hintonburg, and I'm fortunate to be able to use a very low-volume use street to get to the cleared cycling infrastructure, but not everyone is so lucky. Chair, those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Kakish.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here and for the presentation as well. And I certainly agree with some of your comments in terms of it would be nice to have more flexibility in the TMP, and it's such a rigid document where we sort of do it, approve it, wait for years until we are able to move anything. So certainly having fluidity or flexibility in that document would be helpful to us, because there's lots of growth, lots of development. Councillor Leeper spoke about some of the growth in his area, but there's also even more growth in the suburbs. If you look at, you know, my area in Riverside South, Finley Creek, or Barrhaven, and there's always things that are changing and different elements that are changing. For example, the Hard Rocks application just south of Finley Creek in Councillor Deruz's area. So there's always elements or factors that are quickly and rapidly changing the way things are between the reviews that end up happening, and sometimes it's much longer than we would like. But at the same time, I do understand and appreciate that it is an exhaustive process for our staff to undertake that review, and when they do it, it's a lot of resources and time for us, and certainly appreciate the fact that it sets the framework, and there's, you know, stability in terms of what to expect. But the downside to that is that it's a very rigid document, and in between those reviews we can't make changes. So I do appreciate that comment, and that's something that I'll ask to staff later when we ask questions to them. But I also do see in your recommendations, and they're great recommendations, that there are some that are not necessarily, at least the way I interpret them, tied to the TMP, and potentially things that can be sort of parallel, or things that can be worked between those TMP reviews. So I'm interested in, do you feel that, first of all, are you in regular contact with staff in terms of trying to advance those? And I think the chair, I agree with the chair that we are doing some of those things already, but are you in regular contact with staff and trying to advance some of those recommendations that you have? Because I don't think all of them are necessarily tied under the TMP, but maybe that's my interpretation.
I'm very glad you asked, because it is an important point. Clearly, some of these issues are planning related or transportation related. But one of the points we're implicitly, if not explicitly, making here is that one needs to integrate those two. They shouldn't be looked at as silos, because there are a lot of benefits in the integration of the analysis and the thinking and the solutions that are to be found by looking at planning and transportation jointly. We would emphasize that. As to whether we are meeting with staff, my sense is that we've met a fair bit with planning staff. We look forward to meeting more with transportation staff, including on this specific report, and we'd be delighted to do that.
Thank you. And I think the first item, I think you probably heard Councillor Blais and some of my colleagues refer to the overlap between the planning and development, and sometimes the silos you talk about, even though we've clearly set expectations that in new development we'd like the infrastructure to address some of those traffic calming concerns. We're still seeing some gaps there. So I agree with you about the making sure that having those departments work together and implement and execute what we're actually saying, to avoid items like the first item we had today for four-way stops, where we're saying yes to 11 warrants because, you know, that's what we've been doing, and I think my colleagues spoke to that earlier, so I won't go over it, but absolutely I think it is key that we do that. And as I said, I do see some of these things ongoing. Some of them we're working on already, and I do see opportunities that don't necessarily connect it to the TMP where we could advance some of these initiatives that you proposed here. So thank you very much for presenting today and for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I should point out that one of the recommendations of the report is to refer it both to transportation and to planning, and we have our GM of planning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I always forget Steve. It's the longest title in the city, I think, but Steve Willis is here as well. So those meetings that you're talking about will be facilitated through both GMs. So I think we're on the right track in that regard. I believe Councillor Flaherty has a short question.
I do, and thank you for the presentation. I won't go over the elements that are covered because I do think that they were very relevant. Can you clarify to me, like, these are really good fundamentals? A lot of them are underway, or parts of the elements are already being looked at. You know, I'll take your first point or your second point, which is better integration to public transit. So, you know, to me, the Fifton Clegg bridge that was that's begun now is one of the example. Is it a full network of systems? No, but you know, I think it's heading in the right spot. So I just want to clarify the measures that you're bringing forward. You're trying to emphasize those as part of the. You're being what I'm getting from you is you're being proactive in identifying what the priorities should be when the team is ready to review the TMP. Is that?
Very much so. All of which, as Sheila noted at the beginning, is a reflection of what we've heard from our community members across the city. But clearly the linkages between various elements of the transportation system is critical to making it work.
And I think that's important to bring as a nuance, is that you're not asking us to pause work that's underway, and but in certain instances to be more coordinated in that approach and to be more systematic in that approach. So I'm hearing that loud and clear, and certainly that will reflect some of the work going forward. I'm happy to see, because it is kind of a good challenge to think in my mind from point to point, you know, what have we done in my community or you know, in different parts of our city on all of these measures. And you know, very quickly I can point to some of those for most points, which is reassuring. To me, I view the city as the system is in place, the money's available, the services are there, but it's a big machine to prioritize and to align. And when you speak of the gaps between transportation and planning, those often get, you know, either the island divide or the proximity on different issues. To me, and you know, speaking on a personal matter, or one that I've brought up to staff year after year for budget, we haven't prioritized where we plow our sidewalks beyond the main streets on residential area has been of top of mind, specifically near the University of Ottawa. You think of the amount of folks that walk on Cumberland, that walk along Somerset, and you quickly say, well, how come you know, how can we prioritize so at least when the residential beat is started in those zones, that they start with those streets, for example. So, you know, to me, it's not necessarily a question of new money. It's a question of looking at the way we do business and saying, how can we do it a bit differently that might achieve some of those goals. So really, really well done. I think it sets a nice groundwork, and it also highlights some of the things that we've begun and some of the projects we have in place. So really thankful for that you did bring this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no further questions, thank you once again, both you and all the congregant members who came together to put together this report. So on the report, carried? Carried, okay. The next item on the agenda is our Safer Roads update.
Chair, can we ask questions to staff though, or on that?
Sure, if you like. We've carried it, but
it was just
unless you want to revisit whether we carried it or not before you ask questions.
Well, sorry, I missed that, so that's why I'm asking you if I can ask a question to staff. You didn't
certainly.
ask if we can ask questions to
staff.
Yeah,
Ms. Chi is probably the best person to answer the question. She's here with us.
Just about the point I raised earlier in terms of, are there elements of flexibility that we can add into the TMP where if things do come up or elements do change where we'd have the ability to move things around?
That's on.
And so the tweaking that happens, is it generally, if it's happened in the past, in between reviews, is it usually something that the local councillors that are impacted in the area would have to agree to? if they're moving envelopes of money from one pot to another or one project to another? Is that how it usually would work, or what kind of tweaks have been done historically? And are those done just from direction to you, or can they be, or does it have to be through a motion at committee? Okay, and as what's the timeline right now on the next review in terms of, because I've heard mixed things in terms of the actual year, so what year are we planning on reviewing it next? Okay, thanks, Chair.
Very much. The next item on our agenda is the Safer Roads program update, which we have a presentation from staff. Morning, Rob. Krista.
Good morning, councillors. Oops, I had a bit of a booming voice. Before we begin, I just want to introduce my colleagues who are here with us today. To my right is Krista Tanaka, who's the Program Manager for Road Safety and Traffic Investigations in the Transportation Services Department. Also in the public gallery are Superintendent Joan McKenna, who's one of her core responsibilities is the Traffic Enforcement Unit, which I work very, very closely with. Along with her is Staff Sergeant Frank Daou, who is in charge of the Collision Investigation Unit, and that ties in a little bit later in our presentation, as well as Staff Sergeant Brian Bonderud, who supervises the Traffic Enforcement Unit. So just to provide a quick update to committee members and members of the public, Safer Roads Ottawa was originally established in 2011 by City Council, and the foundational partners are Ottawa Fire Service, the Ottawa Paramedic Service, Ottawa Police, Ottawa Public Health and Transportation Services. In June of 2016, the day-to-day operation of the Safer Roads Ottawa program was transferred over to the service, and as a result, I spend part of my time embedded with the Traffic Enforcement Unit based out of Leitrim, as well as working with my colleagues at 100 Constellation.
I'm just wondering if colleagues could hold their conversations during the presentation. Thank you.
From a 2017 highlight perspective, when it touches on the cycling file, we've continued to be the only municipality in all of Ontario to use the 1-meter sonar device to lay charges for unsafe passing of vehicles over cyclists. We've expanded the bike repair station project, and we're very, very happy to announce that the Stay Safe, Stay Back campaign now includes OC Transpo and their fleet, which includes up to 1,000 vehicles. And in fact, this marks the first time that any major transportation service in all of Ontario, if not all of Canada, participates in this program. As bike bike rodeos, we provided safety education to approximately 4,500 students in all elementary and some high schools across the city this year, and that funding came through Safer Roads Ottawa. We also did a fair amount of liaison with the new Canadian population and providing them cycling education as well. Again, we've launched, we're just concluding as of last night, the Be Safe, Be Seen initiative with Ottawa Fire Service, where residents could attend any fire station within the city and get a free and complimentary set of bike lights, a pedestrian light, or a reflective armband. In the coming weeks, we'll be launching a PedSafe app. We've worked very, very closely with members of our internal information technology service to redo an app that was originally launched by first responders on the west coast of the United States, and we've made it more Ottawa friendly, and that'll be happening in the next couple of weeks. We continue to fund community-based pedestrian safety presentations through the Ottawa Safety Council, and we do ongoing education and enforcement blitz with the Ottawa Police Service. As well, we've continued to push the envelope with regards to the Leave the Phone Alone campaign, with all sorts of different initiatives, including decals that we now hand out to drivers to put in their rear view mirrors, as well as our continued outreach to high schools in the area. We've now completed, in the last 2 years, upwards of 36 road safety videos that are now embedded on the Ottawa Police YouTube channel, and we use for all sorts of social media perspectives. We launched, for the first time ever, an enhanced motorcycle safety course, which I'll touch on in a couple of minutes. And one of our significant accomplishments this year was the launch of the Fatal Collision Review Committee, and the successes and some of the positive outcomes that we can touch on that a little bit later. So as I mentioned, Stay Safe, Stay Back now includes approximately, or in the coming weeks, we'll have approximately 2,000 vehicles in our city will have these decals on them. 200 thanks to the city fleet, 800 through our partnership with the private sector, and almost 1,000 vehicles via OC Transpo. In terms of pedestrian engagement, these are just a few of the kind of quick visuals. On the top left is the enhanced pedestrian safety presentation now put on by the Ottawa Safety Council, which includes a crosswalk, the pedestrian lights, and so forth. On the top right-hand corner was a pedestrian crossover enforcement initiative that we did in Barhaven involving plainclothes police officers and a young resident who had lots of concerns in her neighborhood. And then on the bottom center is some of our outreach efforts. In terms of bike repair stations, we now have 27 of them located across the city, of which 9 of them are at transit facilities. And this continues to be an opportunity for us to engage private sector partners to sponsor these stations for up to 3 years at a time as part of an agreement. We already have close to, I think, demand for at least another 18 stations next year, which will be quite a fabulous network. The motorcycle safety course, what we started to notice in analyzing some of the collision data were many of the collisions involving motorcycles involved inappropriate turns by drivers in front of the motorcycle or the motorcyclist themselves. And so we launched, working with the motorcycle masters, we launched a one-day, 4-hour kind of course for 2 separate groups of individuals. We surveyed them before in terms of the length of time that they had been driving a motorcycle and some of their experiences. And what we found afterwards is 95% of the motorcyclists stated that it increased their ability to avoid a collision, and 65% of them used the emergency brake techniques which we taught them within 30 days of completing the course. And in fact, one of the riders on their way home following the course used the front braking mechanism or technique that was taught to them to avoid getting into a collision with a driver. The 1 meter device, once again, we do this with not only a traffic enforcement unit, but also members of Central Patrol, and we go out and we do undercover work. So, and a couple of different examples was on Wellington Street, we've gone on to Bank Street, and so on, and to date, I believe we are the only jurisdiction in Ontario to have laid, we're up to about 24 charges against drivers for unsafe passes. From a technology perspective, Most recently, we launched the Smart Cone Pilot Initiative on O'Connor, which involved working with Smart Cone Technologies based in Stittsville, a local startup company. And essentially, over the period of quite a number of months, we developed a technology that would detect a cyclist approaching an intersection using not only cameras but thermal imaging, and it would light up a series of 9 bollards that were located on either side of the intersection. We've begun the analyzing of conflict data prior to installation, as well as following, and we hope to have some results in the next 30 days or so. As well, we purchased a second automated license plate reader for the Ottawa Police in the Traffic Enforcement Unit. And as many of you are aware, we've now caught, in the first year of the initiative, close to 200 suspended drivers have been charged and caught. A number of different individuals, I believe it's close to 1,300 long-time plate validation stickers or individuals driving who had expired validation tags, as well as people who were wanted on warrants for different reasons. And this is all using this kind of technology. And the school bus camera project, although we had hoped to have launched the initiative this past fall, we are aggressively working our way through the various different privacy requirements to successfully put the project in place. And we're hoping in the next few months that we'll have some very, very positive news. Our initial privacy impact assessment that we sent to the Information and Privacy Commissioner's Office was well received. We have some tweaks to do, but we're very confident that in a matter of, hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll have the first of the 6 cameras out on buses in our community. In terms of car seat safety, we work very, very closely with the Ottawa Safety Council to deliver clinics for parents who want to learn how to install their child's car seat properly. This data itself doesn't include anything happening in the last few weeks, so this was taken about a month ago, but we'll probably by the end of this year have helped install about 1,000 car seats. The clinics, it's a wonderful initiative involving Ottawa Fire Services and a number of other partners who free up their facilities for these clinics to take place. The clinics themselves are delivered by volunteers and staff from the Ottawa Safety Council, and we're also happy to note that there's a note from the auxiliary staff of the Ottawa Police Service to have their 20+ members, or approximately 20 members, trained to be car seat technicians for 2018. From a slowdown for us perspective, we received 250 individual requests in 2017, and approximately 3,500 signs were delivered across the community. In terms of the other community signs that we offer, please walk your bike, please stop for us, and we developed a new one for the Leave the Phone Alone campaign, which is, the one on the right is an initiative that we launched with St. Mark's School down in Councillor DeRuse's ward, where the students approached us and wanted to do something about distracted driving in their wards. And so we worked very, very closely with the Traffic Enforcement Unit on that initiative. We're also happy to note that we provided seed funding for the Crystal Bay Center for Special Education in order for them to finally get over the goal line, so to speak, with regards to the safety village. And the idea here is to provide some of the highest need students in the community with the opportunity to learn relatively real world, or learn in a relatively real world scenario what it's like to cross, how to use the crosswalks safely, and so forth. As well as part of that initiative, we launched some relatively different road sign designs, which would just kind of push the message home to drivers that they're driving through a particular area of the city where we had some challenges with compliance on a number of levels. And tomorrow, this is a sneak peek, but we'll be kind of invigorating the report impaired driver signage that you see around the city, along with Mothers Against Drunk Driving and the 30th anniversary of the Red Ribbon campaign. We'll be unveiling these officially tomorrow, and these will replace the signs that are currently in the community. We're also happy to state that first time, in my experience, that the Museum of Science and Technology invited us to donate 2 of the Cyclists Can Take the Lane Stop Honking signs to be added to their permanent collection, which I kind of is quite a novel, kind of an interesting thing. So Councillor Cloutier and Councillor Chernyshenko attended with us for that presentation. And in the coming weeks, as per direction from the Director of Traffic Services, Phil Landry, these high collision location signs will be going in some of the top 10 collision locations where we know rear-end collisions are a common occurrence, in order to raise awareness and hopefully get the message out to give appropriate distance when following behind an individual in front of you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and it never ceases to amaze me what innovative ideas this little, and I stress little program, there's not a lot of staff involved, but through partnerships and community development, you come up with some really clever and interesting ways. And I just wanted to highlight, been to a number of announcements this year around safer roads, but the one that sticks in my head is the opening of the safety village at Crystal Bay. The kids were just thrilled to have that opportunity, and it's an example of a true partnership, because the council and the student's mother who had started the thing was in tears when she was talking about the journey they had made from the idea to the construction. And so you do some great work, and that I think is a real example of how you are able to leverage those partnerships both within the city staff and services, but also outside with community groups and private providers. So first of all, we have Councillor Manette has a question. He'll be followed by Councillor Fleury.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really interested in the bike repair stations that you identified. Is there any in the Orleans area? Because I wasn't aware of any.
Off the top of my head, Councillor, I believe the closest one in Orleans currently is at the Ray Friel Center, okay, and attached to one of the public libraries.
What's the cost to put one of these in place?
So the cost of the actual station itself is just about $2,200, and so we have a tender with a vendor. And then from there, depending on the location, whether or not we have to pour a concrete pad is what can have an impact on the overall cost. But we go out to the private sector partners and we ask them for $2,500 to cover the cost of the actual station, as well as a little bit of the maintenance, and then we take on the rest of the cost of installation.
So if I have suggested sites for next time around, just forward you the names of the sites? Or?
Correct, Councillor. And then we generally want to work closely with community associations or the private sector partners themselves.
Now, if I wanted to be more proactive and use some of my CIL to make the mapping quicker, is there any way to get the funding paid after the fact, sort of thing? Or reimbursed into the CIL?
I believe so, yes.
I'm looking at, we have major bike paths along the riverfront, and something like that would be fantastic for the cyclists to be able to use, especially if they run into trouble, that they would know that there's a station nearby. I'm talking about close to Roy Hobbs Center, close to St. Louis. It is now St. Louis. As you know, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people that use that bike path on a daily basis. And, I'm trying to get it so that it's used also in the winter. So, I'm sure that cyclists could also benefit from that bike path in the winter if we're able to get what I'm looking at. Anyways, I will forward you those two suggestions as two sites, and I will also check with Parks and Rec, see if it would be possible to use my CIL to advance it more quickly.
Perfect. Thanks, Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fleury.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to echo what you were saying. And unfortunately, at committee, we only have 5 minutes, so I can't, go on and on with all of the great work that Rob, you and your team have done in my community, and that I see over Twitter on citywide. So certainly, the time and effort and impact it's truly felt, and we want to continue to support the initiatives that you brought forward and continue to innovate, because I do think that they do bear success. But I had three questions on your report that I was surprised to see in the report. One you highlighted, which is the plate reader. And the plate reader to me is like, who cares about the plate reader rather than like it's an OPS matter? Why does it fall into Safer Roads Ottawa?
So there's two parts to that question, Councillor. So the first and foremost is there, at any given time in the city of Ottawa, there's approximately 24,000 people, or sorry, 24,000 drivers in the city of Ottawa whose licenses are suspended for one reason or another. So, and as I mentioned last year to committee, that is approximately enough people to fill a whole game for the Ottawa Red Blacks. So from there, those individuals are actually driving when they shouldn't be. And a fair number of those are from a medical perspective, so a loss of a license due to any kind of medical reason, but a significant number of those are because they've lost the right to drive from a criminal perspective. They may have, it might be related to impaired driving, it might be related to unpaid fines and so on. So when we were working closely with police, this was one of the ideas that came up was, what is our one way to find these folks and try to ensure as much as possible that they're, if they've lost the right to drive and your license has been pulled by the Ministry of Transportation, how do we go and ensure that our roads remain safe? And so the idea, if you're driving without any insurance and something happens, the ability for your family to lay a claim against the driver of that vehicle is exceptionally limited. Just one example, so of driving without insurance, but we just realized that a fair number of these people should not be on the road for whatever indication. So it tied into road safety from that perspective.
Okay, I appreciate that. And the revenue from that, from those fines or those incidents, how are they going back into your program or into the general revenue sources?
So at the current time, any revenue generated goes back into general revenue for the City of Ottawa. As per the automated speed enforcement, as well as the Vision Zero directive that we received from Transportation Committee, we've been asked to look at all of the different forms of revenue and how they can be brought back into a road safety fund. And that'll be part of the report that comes back to Transportation in 2019 on how we're going to, or how we would propose to fund the Safer Roads Ottawa program going forward. One aspect of that would be revenue from the automated license plate reader. Other examples would be the school bus camera project and so forth. So we're going to come back looking at best practices from across Canada and then put those options in front of committee.
Okay. And just finally on the school bus, because I do think it's, you know, it's a massive fine when caught, but I think, you know, regularly we see offenders, so the majority of situations go uncaught. So would it be the province's responsibility to mandate that each bus have these cameras, these measures, so that instantly every incident would be tracked and followed up on? Like, how would you see that evolve?
There is, I believe, I would imagine that the province could set up such a requirement. From our perspective, working closely with the traffic enforcement staff, we don't necessarily see it as a comprehensive problem on every single bus route. We do see it mostly on roadways where 4 lanes or more that are undivided, and those are scattered throughout the city. So as part of our project, we wanted to go with a maximum of 6 cameras or 6 camera systems on 6 different buses, and let the bus providers themselves those around the city where they had hot spots. So at the current time, I believe putting individual cameras on every single bus within the city might be considered to be too much, but if it gets mandated, then we'll have to react accordingly, because that footage will still need to be reviewed by the enforcement staff. So it would significantly increase the amount of time that we would have to dedicate to that kind of activity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Chernyshenko.
Thanks very much. Rob, it's been a pleasure to work with you on many initiatives, and I know that the only thing holding you back from doing more is money, and that's in our court to to help you with. We've all got our limits. That was an interesting statistic about the number of plates of people who should not be in that car driving that you've managed to pick up. Of course, the metaphor, if you will, or the comparison to filling a Red Black stadium, as the councillor who's got the stadium in his ward. I hope those people aren't driving to any Red Blacks games, but that number of people are off the road wherever they're driving is a good thing. A question for you about the cycling tools and pump station. I've on a few occasions myself and heard reports of ones that weren't in terribly good shape, whether the bolts that were holding them into the pad had fallen over or bent, or the pump seal wasn't adequate and it wasn't working properly. Is that something you're aware of and working with? Because we often go to the lowest bidder, and the city, the maintenance of things that we build isn't as good as it should be. So on that side of things, I think the lowest bidder wins, but the stuff doesn't work, or that we put them in and they're not being adequately maintained. The cyclist comes across it and says, excellent, great, oh, it's not working. What's the status of monitoring them and maybe encouraging feedback from cyclists who encounter non-functioning ones to let us know?
Correct. So on that note, Councillor, we created a series of videos to show people how to properly use the air pump. That was the number one concern that we were receiving from residents, is in most cases, residents were using the wrong kind of valve to fill up their tires. So it's the Schrader and the Presta valve, which was confusing folks. And so we created a few different videos, and we're trying to push those out through our own social media accounts as well as that of the Ottawa Police. On the maintenance question, we have had, which we thought were very, very secure stations, we have had the occasional time where people have taken out power tools and ground the bolts off and stolen the air pumps themselves. So we are trying to work on an option that wouldn't be possible, although it's fairly challenging with a motivated individual. If they want the air pump, they're probably going to get it. And on the longer term maintenance discussion, we're looking at a tender for 2018 based on the total number of stations we now have. It is no longer feasible for us to get out there and to replace different pieces. We're looking at putting it out to tender so that within a 24-hour period of being notified that there's a problem, everything gets over at the station. So the pump gets a maintenance done to it, and valves are changed and so on. So we're quite confident that we'll have that in place for the spring of 2018.
Thank you. Some human behavior never fails to amaze. I guess you can go get a decent pump for under $30 at a station. That's an awful lot of work. Bizarre. Speaking, I suppose, of some behavior never fails to amaze, you put up the signs that we were essentially, for the history, for my colleagues and everyone else here, we were essentially forced to create a sign which was more aggressive for drivers and for cyclists, because the message of the cyclist, claim your lane because it's the only safe be, and for the driver, the cyclist is meant to be in the middle of the lane, stop harassing them, as you know, was the message we had to get out there, because we had a bridge that was under construction and there was simply no other place to ride than to share the lane. I'd love to think that those signs are consigned to a museum and we'd never have to bring anything like it out again, but we do encounter, there will be more construction projects. There are existing roads where there are places. I went under a bridge I went out to Canada for an electric vehicle day last Friday, and there is a bridge that you have to pass under at a certain point where it's just too narrow. There is no other, and the sign is there for the cyclist, but it's cases like that where both the driver and cyclist need to understand that's your shared lane during that time. Is there the possibility that that sort of sign, that model could be used again, or quite only copies of those in a museum now, or could we bring them back out or have some for cases where something like that is needed?
We've left those in the toolkit that councillors and also staff can request, and they can be reproduced at any time by the sign shop.
Because while it's a fun idea, and maybe it's the only chance anything I've helped to create will be in a museum, it's still a useful tool, not just a history piece. So thank you very much. Carry on.
Thank you, Councillor, and I echo your words about people never ceasing to amaze. I said at the beginning, the work that you do, never ceases to amaze me. The fact that people are taking all that time and effort to vandalize and take the bike pumps, I really don't. It's the first time I've heard it, and it's really quite shocking. In any event, Councillor Leeper.
Thanks, and to theme of behaviors that amaze. It strikes me, and I realize that my perspective is somewhat skewed, that I'm picking up incidents and data from social media, but we've seen a number of single car rollovers, single cars hitting telephone poles in recent months in areas where it just does not make sense that people would be doing so, and I understand sometimes that's probably the result of a medical emergency, but you know, seeing some of the rollovers this summer on Gladstone speaking to the speed with which people are traveling. You have a fatal collision review committee, and I'd love to hear more about that, but what do we do about some of those incidents where no one is actually hurt, or it doesn't result in a fatality, to try to understand why some of the incidents that frankly boggle the mind are happening, and whether or not there's anything we can do to minimize the potential for those?
From a fatal collision review committee perspective, we're towards the tail end of obviously 2017, and our hope is, working closely with Superintendent McKenna and Staff Sergeant Daou and the rest of the committee members, is to bring forward the annual review to Police Service Board in very early 2018 and make it more of a public framework so people understand some of the work that's gone into it and what are some of those outcomes and what are some of those findings. So on that note, I think it's fairly clear. The other thing, I don't know more appropriate for Krista Tanaka to answer the question about when there's no injuries and are we looking at roadway redesigns and so on. There are a few that come up to us where we just have no information potentially as to what happened or why an individual chose to drive at such a high rate of speed. We do know that the fatal fours often that are coined by the Ontario Provincial Police, so speed, distraction, impairment, and seatbelts do play a role in a lot of the fatal collisions that we have in our city, unsurprisingly so. And after 40 years, we know that there's a fair number of people who still don't wear their seatbelts. And so in almost any kind of collision, whether it's medium to high speed, that's going to have a tremendous impact on injury type and so forth. So we try to look at as much of that information as possible and then work together as a team to try to either come up with, in the case of the Fatal Collision Review Committee, we look at engineering modifications, we look at education opportunity, push out enhanced messaging, and we certainly look at enforcement and how all three of those can come together and hopefully reduce that type of collision from occurring again.
I see any number of could have been absolutely catastrophic in which people are walking away and the only damage is to our brave team of hydro poles. The second question, sorry, I had the second one for you. So one of the interesting things about the Fatal Review, the Fatal Collision Review Committee, do you consider that's one of the preconditions of having a Vision Zero? It strikes me that with this work underway, that we are actually coming close to the point where we can say that we have a Vision Zero approach in the city of Ottawa.
From having had the opportunity as a team to sit down at these collisions and some of the factors that have gone into it, we've never had access to that kind of teamwork before. And really looking at it from a multidisciplinary perspective, as we're putting together the Vision Zero kind of report to coming back, we would think it's fundamental for a municipality to be able to look at, in relatively close proximity to when the collisions happened, to figure out what's going on and the information be gleaned accordingly, because too often in the past we were relying on data from a year or more in the past. Right. So whereas this is relatively real time, within a matter of days we are reviewing a collision in some significant detail. So I think it's going to be paramount that the committee continue, and I think some of the members of the committee accordingly will be sharing the success and the findings with their peers, whether that's the superintendent and her colleagues at both the provincial and national level, but also the chief supervising coroner or the regional supervising coroner, Dr. Louise McNaughton, sharing it with her colleagues across Ontario. And I believe her intention was to see about the idea of actually making a fatal collision review committee mandatory for all jurisdictions in Ontario. So that's another claim to fame that we would have.
That's exciting. I'm very much looking forward more. One of the things that comes up from time to time in the city is, it is sensitive, but yesterday, for example, we saw another example of a cyclist who was taking their lane in order to remain safe, and being told by the police that that is not appropriate in a space, that there is sometimes disclarity or unclarity around what the rules of the road are, and that, you know, individual officers on the streets themselves may not always understand what the HTA says about cyclist safety. How are we addressing ensuring that all of our officers on the road, whose job it is to protect those vulnerable road users, understand the Highway Traffic Act and exactly how that's interpreted?
Yeah, if I've asked the superintendent to come down.
Perfect.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm aware there was a tweet about a person who was stopped on Greenbank Road by a police officer. So I'm very familiar with Greenbank Road. I'm also a cyclist as well. And from my own personal opinion, I don't think I would take any lane on Greenbank Road at any point. And I don't know the exact location. I don't know what the officer said. I can only surmise from the exchange it would have been a sharing of information and a concern for the safety of the cyclists involved. So
it's not necessarily isolated. I mean, it's rare. I'm not suggesting that you know, our officers don't know the law, but it comes up often enough in the course of a year that it's something I think, you know, it's incumbent on us to explore.
So it's something from a police service that we can help educate our officers about that. We have done internal messaging on the 1 meter rule as well, right. So we can continue that. And the HTA is a large incumbent volume of information, and I know there's certain sections that I'd have to ask our traffic officers for specific details, but I can ensure that will take place.
So there is internal ongoing opportunities to talk to officers when issues are, to make sure that the HTA is being properly interpreted.
Yes, any new legislation, we are very aware of it, and we share that with all of our members.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much, Superintendent. Do I have time for one more? If it's brief. I am interested in hearing about the educational efforts for New Canadian in the city. I think earlier this summer we saw an example of some cyclist behavior that may have arisen from not knowing how the roads work. How are you delivering that education to New Canadians about cycling safety?
We work closely with our partners in Parks and Recreation, who have a number of different contacts, not only at the Catholic Center for Immigration, but a variety of different partners in the community who work with, and another example that comes to mind is the Healthy Transportation Coalition, and the number of individuals that they come into contact with. So the education itself might be in the form of a bike rodeo paired up with a bike mechanic from Right Bike being in attendance to show people how to properly maintain their bikes, all the way to involving private sector partners to either donate bicycles, and we then come to the table with helmets. And so we kind of make it a perfect circle in terms of the education piece, letting people know what's expected of them on the road, and then work with community to get bikes and other kind of pieces of equipment to the individuals themselves. So depending on the type of event, I know that Councillor Cloutier launched a bike drive in his community for residents to donate bikes that we then made sure that were roadworthy through our partnership with Right Bike, and then we provided the bikes to the kids in the neighborhood, but we made sure that they got education at the same time. So it's not just about giving free bike and get going, it's you really have to know as much of the rules of the road as possible in a fun and friendly way.
No, it's exciting work and critical work, and if there's any way that city councillors can help, I'm sure that we all would be more than happy to. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. It's Cruz, but I'm going to jump in quickly if you don't mind, because now the superintendent's at the table. It reminds me of a question that I wanted to ask. We, over the last year, 18 months, there's been a real shift in how traffic enforcement is done, what the impetus for it is, and it's very much metric and data driven now, based on complaints from residents. And in that regard, one of the concerns that I've heard raised, and I just want to bring the attention and see what, if anything, the OPS has planned to address is, I've heard that the online reporting system for some people is a bit lengthy for something as simple as seeing a car I shouldn't say simple, I mean, it should be simple to report a car speeding or going through a red light or a stop sign or what have you. I don't know if the organization itself has heard that concern raised, and if so, what steps might you be taking to make that reporting process a little bit more simple and accessible to the average person?
So we changed our service delivery model in January, and our traffic enforcement is based on, it's driven by complaints, and we want to be more strategic when we deploy our resources for enforcement. So we have opened the online process. So we have recently updated our website to make it more user-friendly. So if you have a traffic complaint, and if it's just about speeding, you click this button, and we need this information. But if you have a traffic complaint, you have a license plate, you can identify the driver. Here's the information that we need. And then if we have a third area where if there's follow-up that needs to be done by our traffic unit, that option is there. So there's more information needed. If you get the license plate, if you can identify the driver, we will need more information from you. So then we can make a call back to review the situation and information that is presented to us.
And I'm pleased to hear that you're making it simpler to use for people, since that's the engine really that's making the enforcement go forward. Maybe, I don't know if it's too much trouble if something could be sent out from OPS to all of us, because I'm sure that's something that we could share with our community associations, with FCA, to just let people know, because I know I'm not getting concerns about, I'm not going to go on there and spend 10 minutes every time I see a car or whatever. So if it's simpler and faster and better to use, if you can push that information out and then we can share it with our networks, I think that would be really helpful. Okay, thank you, Councillor Drews, and over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank Rob and the team for this great presentation, and I know I've been working with you for a while, and thank you very much. We do lots of initiatives. I know you heard it across the table on pricing and making sure that you keep our community safe, and education is great tools. I do have a few comments and a few questions, and I'm going to carry on and echo the chair on the simplifying the application. That we hear it time and time again from our community that it's hard. Every time you see a speeding car, it's going to take you 10, 15 minutes. And I'm very happy to hear that there is simplifying issue, and if we I echo his concern. If we can share it with us, put it in our newsletters and in our bulletin, share it with our community, that will be easy, because I mean, we've been trying hard. Our issue in our community, we talk about speed all the time, and we did put lots of speed boards in this term of council. Most of the councillors in this room and the councillors that are not here, we invested so much money in SIs and put so many speed boards. I know myself, I have around 17 in my community, and we keep hearing that we put them in our community to make sure that to make the OPS job easier and to help also the community. There is some people, believe it or not, they take the social media and Facebook to report the speeding, which is no one's listening to it, right? But we need the real data, and the real data is that we are putting and we're investing in these tools that right now. Do we have an idea or report that comes to us every year on how the working, so be able to share them with our community? Because we keep hearing, oh, well, we call this police, the police don't show up. We have a speed board, we have really real issues in our community with speed and driving and the initiative we're putting out, but I don't think we're getting the end results to share with our community to encourage them actually to make that phone call. We talk about make the right call, we talk about leave the phone alone, we talk about the speed board, but then yet we don't have the data and we don't have enough information to share the good story to our community, and I think that's where we are failing. We're failing on getting the data and all the work we've been doing to share with the community, and that's, I think, we need, if we're able to get and these data and how much we're working with our community, that will be amazing, good information for us to share with the community. Can you see if you can answer and see if we can give us some of the that specifically on the speed board and the speed that's happening in the community?
Yeah, the speed board data, for all the councillors who have purchased speed boards through their strategic initiatives, we do provide the data summary for each of the boards on a quarterly basis to the councillors' offices. For all other types of temporary traffic calming that we've implemented through the strategic initiative, we have committed to doing a one before and one after speed survey to determine the effectiveness of those measures. We've recently completed the data collection. Now we just have to crunch the numbers. So over the months we'll be doing that, and we'll be able to provide the councillors with the results of those for the measures that they've implemented in their wards.
And are these highlighted area that if we notice on some area where the speed board are being reported quarterly to OPS, and do we have a result of these data? Like, do we have a result of highlighting identify some real issue or area, like Mitch Owens, I'm just going to throw a name, could be Hunt Club, but are we really capturing on these and reporting them to OPS, and are we getting a result back to the community on what these initiatives are doing for them?
We are providing the data for all of our spot speed surveys and all of our speed board data that we collect. We do push them straight to the server on OPS's side to provide them with that data so that they can inform their enforcement initiatives. I'm not sure what the process is to get back on the enforcement side, so I'll pass that over.
So we do use the speed board data to support it's called our STEP, our selective traffic enforcement programs for the month, where we will target our high collision intersections, our speeding areas where we know that it's happening, and we'll use this information to target the dates, the times, when we know from this information that people are traveling at a higher than rated speed. So we share that information, and then we target those areas.
Thank you, Superintendent. And are these, there is a possibility for the ward councillor at this time to share these issue with the community, so be able, if we have a problem in Stagecoach or Mitch Owens, can you be able to share these info with a specific ward councillor, so at least they'll be aware of the situation?
So if you make that request for that specific area, we would share that information, because we get citizens complaining about a certain area and there's a speed board in that area. We will use both the information from the citizens as well as the speed board to select our enforcement in that area and just help us to narrow the times and dates.
Thank you, Superintendent. My other question will be about the Fatal Collision Review Committee. I know that Councillor Leeper touched a little bit on it. Do we have a report yearly that comes to council or to this committee that about where is the highlighted issue of intersections? I know that in my area there is a few intersections, and I think one of them in particular was being reviewed. Do we have those results, and will this committee receive an itemized items or area identify?
Councillor, on an annual basis, we, through the Director of Transportation Services, Traffic Services, Phil Landry's group, the annual collision data summaries are shared. So the top 10 locations for vehicles, as well as detailed information on cycling, pedestrian, and motorcycle collisions are shared. And my understanding is in the next week or more, that information will then be made public. Is that what you were referring to?
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Well, thank you very much, and I'm really happy to hear that there is education program we put out, and we're spending lots of money on educating and for speed slow down in our community, and I'm happy to hear the workshop, because you know what, cyclists are it's very good. It's a great things in our community, and we encourage it. But also there is some cyclists that they don't really know the rules of the road, and we've seen it time after time. And those cyclists that make it bad for other cyclists, that the good behaving cyclists, that they understand the rules, and some of them need their education. I see that. I'm happy to hear that there is some education program, and we need to emphasize a little bit more. Not everyone just go ahead and buy a bike and put it on the road without understanding the rules, because it increase in accident and increase in collisions. And I seen it time after time driving downtown, how some of the cyclists behaving that they just They think if the red light doesn't apply to them, or the signs or the rules of the road doesn't apply into them, it's crazy how many amount of people does break the rules day in and day out, and yet we talk about the 1 meter to stay away 1 meter away from cyclists, and we put all this money educating drivers, but yet I don't see we do enough to educate cyclists to keep them safe and to keep them not to keep them understanding the rules of the road. So I'm really happy to hear that. And in closing, I really thank you very much for everything you do in our community, because you guys, education is important, and making the right call and working with the community is great tools. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Quadri. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And first of all, to Rob and his team, I just want to echo Chair's comments earlier about the work that you and your team have done in such a short time in different areas in the city. And the one piece that I'm really impressed with, that you're working with the partners, both internal and external, and you're going out there looking for those partners when a need arises. And the example that you gave about Smart Cone Technologies located in Stittsville, classic example where you went out to a private sector and said, or maybe the private sector approached you and said, you're facing this issue or this dilemma, here's a way to solve it, or I have a product that can help you. And I think that's opening more doors from a safety perspective to not only for the community to get involved, but also for your program to go further and beyond what you're doing today. Having said that, and there was a question or a comment about ALPR vehicles that are deployed by OPS, I had the opportunity a couple of months ago to ride in one of those and sit at the roadside and see its work. And I was amazed in terms of the number of vehicles or the number of license plates that it could identify within a second or within 2 seconds. And, you know, it gives the officer an inclusionary hand in terms of enforcement. So that individual, the officer can go to the next vehicle and say, here's a vehicle coming and do the monitoring on it. And that's a good program coming in, and I'm glad that we were able to purchase a second vehicle on that. In terms of the program for Safe Roads Ottawa, I think my issue would be in terms of what was discussed on another item by this committee about getting ahead of the curve. Doing communities, or building communities, or informing communities well before they're even planned, to say, how do we make this community safe? And I hope that you're getting involved. Maybe you can't give me an answer on that. Are you getting involved with the planning department today or even yesterday to say, hey, we're planning this new community, how are we going to make it safer in terms of roads as we construct them, rather than fixing the problem after the issue has arisen?
I mean, certainly from my perspective, Councillor, I haven't been, from a Safer Roads Ottawa perspective, we haven't been involved in planning level decisions and building better suburbs. I know that's a role that the Director of Traffic Services, Phil Landry, has played in terms of from an engineering perspective, and obviously Phil and his team are very, very involved in that process. I think with the direction from Transportation Committee from looking at adopting a Vision Zero-like framework, I think it'll be incumbent upon us to work with all internal partners on how we can build and retrofit our communities to make them compliant with the Vision Zero premise, which is, removing the responsibility from drivers and so on, and building a safer built environment and retrofitting it. So I think that those types of engagements will happen as we move forward, as we put together the project charter and so much more for the report to come back to Transportation Committee. That would be one of our fundamental expectations.
Thank you for that, Rob, and I'm glad you mentioned building better, smarter suburbs that some of my colleagues are involved in, and I think that's a key piece. I know Mr. Landry is involved in that process, but I think you, as representing Safer Roads Ottawa, I know you're part of the traffic department, but you should have an input into that also, wherever you can. I think that's a key in building new communities. In terms of the partners that we spoke about, and you mentioned Ottawa Public Health, and as chair of the Ottawa Public Health, I'm happy to see that partnership, because I think that partnership benefits both of us. It helps the OPH, as well as the Safer Roads Ottawa. And the thing that I really appreciate and enjoy is seeing the two departments out in the public together. To get that message out to the public that safety is not just a transportation, but it's a concern across the board for the city. And so I want to thank you for that. The bicycle repair station just came up with the Councilor Manette's questioning. In terms of going forward, I know we installed one at the Trans-Canada Trail, and that's one that's very well used. What about installing more along that trail, for example, or as I was mentioning about installing them along the river parkway? I know the process seems simple, but what are your timelines? I know you said you already have 18 more applications for next year. What kind of timeline, if, say, myself were to put in another request, how far are we looking at?
I think the biggest run into with bike repair stations is when we have a scenario where a cement pad has to be poured, and finding a local contractor, given the large-scale construction projects going on in the city, who's willing to pour 3 feet by 6 feet worth of concrete in sometimes relatively isolated locations. So that has always been the challenge with the program. I think the second part, we never anticipated that we would have had 27 different locations in year 1.5 of, or year 2, I guess, of the project. So we're going to be looking at that over the winter months in terms of what our realistic capacity could be for the whole project, whether that's both from a tendering perspective of the cement and the installation of the actual stations, as well as garnering the private sector interest, because we want to really make this cost neutral to residents. Moving forward, and as much as possible we've done that. So we think we're in a good position now to be able to accommodate most requests as long as we receive them relatively early in the fiscal year.
Thank you very much, Rob. And one final question, Mr. Chair, if I may, is the school boards. Are you getting involved with the school boards, or are the school boards willing to participate in the program?
I think from my perspective, we mostly have contacts with schools themselves when there's concerns from a speeding perspective, distracted driving, and so on. I know our colleagues at Ottawa Public Health have very, very entrenched relationships with the school boards at a macro level, and so would our colleagues from the Ottawa Police Service perspective. Our main contact with the school boards at the current time would be for the school bus camera project. So we'll be not only with their legal but also their privacy staff in order to have the various different agreements signed that are going to be required. So at the moment we deal more with the micro in terms of school by school, but our colleagues as part of Safer Roads Ottawa certainly macro and the board issues themselves.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I don't see anybody else on the list. Just one thing I wanted to mention while you were having that exchange with Councillor Caudry, I just asked Kevin Wary, of course, who manages Public Works. He says they've never been asked, but if you were to ask them about doing some of those smaller cement pad jobs where you're having difficulty finding a private contractor, that's something that could probably be worked out. So it gives you another option. Received on this report? Okay, thank you very much. Are there any notices of motion for consideration at a subsequent meeting? Okay, any inquiries? If there's any other business, so adjournment, and our next meeting is December the 6th, 2017, when we'll be dealing with the budget, so make sure to set aside enough time to be here for a good part of the day. Thank you very much.